Well, good morning. It's good to be with you guys. As Michael said, we are in the campground, so welcome to that. If we've never met before, my name is David Black. I'm the campus pastor here. And one thing that we believe firmly, and I think something that God has definitely been reminding us of and teaching us of here at Grace Church, is that we believe that the church is actually people. It's not a building. And so sometimes we'll say it's people, not a steeple, right? And that's a good thing, that the church is people. It's also probably the most difficult thing. In fact, dealing with one another, loving one another well, that's something that is not easy to do, and yet the Bible calls us to do that, and Jesus enables us to do that. And I just want to say quickly, before we jump into what we're doing, I just thank you so much for this past year. It's been a year, and you have been so gracious. You've been willing to meet in a tent. I feel like we're playing this game show, like, would you meet with us if we met in a tent? Would you meet with us if we met in a campground? What about in the ocean? No, I don't know. Well, I'm not sure what we're doing next, but hopefully what we're doing next is getting into that space over there. But I have enjoyed your willingness, your flexibility, so thank you for that. If you are new with us, this is part of the gathering where we get together. We open up the Bible. We call it God's heart because we love to see what His heart actually says about our heart, and we believe that's how God actually changes us and talks with us. And the way that we do that typically is through what we call a series or a discussion or a message. And our series is actually built to be one long conversation. And so you are actually, if you're here for the first time today, you picked a great day to show up. Not only because it's the first day that we've met inside in 280 days, but also because today we are starting that conversation. We're starting a new series together. It's a series entitled Following Jesus, Living Here. And it's a series that's actually all about the book of the Bible in the New Testament called 1 Peter. And so if you're not familiar with that, today, just to give you a heads up, today's the introduction to this. And so you actually came at the best time that you could, both for the heat inside and also to kind of set you up for where we're going in the weeks to come. Really quick, 1 Peter, we call it a book. If you grew up in the church, it's the books of the Bible. But there's a lot of different literature in the Bible. In fact, what we're looking at today in 1 Peter is actually a letter. It's a letter, or the fancy word for that is epistle. I don't know why we just say letter, but that's what it is. It's a letter. It was written by a guy named Peter, who was one of the first followers of Jesus. In fact, he was a disciple of Jesus. Later on, he was called an apostle because he spent time with Jesus and he was sent out by Jesus to kind of talk about who he is. Peter's job in real life, before he was a follower of Jesus, his sole job was a fisherman. That's what he did. His family owned a fishing company on the Sea of Galilee, and so his dad and his probably dad's dad and probably his dad's dad's dad were all fishermen, and that's what he did. And we'll talk a little bit more about who Peter is in a minute. But what Peter is doing in writing a letter is he's not writing a letter to talk about who Jesus is or the teachings of Jesus. So he's not saying, hey guys, I'm writing this letter so that you would know all that Jesus said and did and all that he taught. In fact, Peter has already done that, and it's in the Bible. It's called the book of Mark, or the Gospel of Mark. It's the story of Jesus in Mark. Mark was Peter's guy who wrote down the stories from Peter. So if you want to know what Peter thought about what Jesus did and said, that's the book of Mark. You can go and read that. It's real short, really straight to the point, kind of like Peter a little bit. He's not writing, because sometimes in the church, sometimes, or in the Bible, you'll have letters that were written to a church that was just kind of messed up. I know every church is messed up, but really messed up. And so sometimes they had to write a letter and say, you guys are really messed up. And so this is not that. Okay, Peter's not writing this letter to address an issue in the church, like stop hanging out or just stop, just go. He's not doing that. Likewise, Peter's also not writing because he wants to unpack some new doctrine or teaching. Like sometimes Paul, another guy who wrote some letters in the New Testament, sometimes he'd write and he's like, I want you to really understand and really grasp this doctrine or this belief about the Holy Spirit or Jesus or God or what's going on with who you are. That's not why he's writing. Peter is writing the first epistle that we have from him, the first letter, And the reason he's writing that is to answer one question. And that question is this: how do I follow Jesus here? How do I follow Jesus here? And what I think is so interesting about this question is that how, you already know this, how is not an information question, right? It's not simply saying, oh, what? What do I do to follow Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus? That would be information. Like, here's some info, learn the thing, take the test, follow. How is an application question. And how is a question that actually has to be answered in life time and time and time again. It means this, you know this already. You know that it's entirely possible in life to have all the information and to have all the instructions and still struggle and still get stuck because you might be staring at something and going, how do I do what I think I know how to do in this context and this environment? And this might seem dumb and kind of simple, but when I was thinking about that this week, I couldn't help but think about one specific room in the house, and hopefully you all have one or have access to one. It's the kitchen. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I would hope that if I came over to visit, you would have a kitchen of some sort. I don't know if you've ever thought about kitchens, but kitchens have changed a lot through the years, but all of the kitchens that have ever been, even the last decades, while they might look different in appearance, every kitchen kind of has the same sort of stuff, right? There's things that make it a kitchen. So, for example, I just brought a list. We probably named some, but like every kitchen hopefully has a sink, right? That would be weird if it didn't. Every kitchen has a stove. Every kitchen has a fridge. Every kitchen has some sort of dishes, whether that's Goodwill or you got married and that's how you got your dishes. I don't know how you get your dishes, where you got them from, but every kitchen has dishes, utensils, silverware, some sort of pots and pans. So there's things that we would expect to find in a kitchen, no matter what it looked like. In fact, I brought along another picture here of just kitchens throughout the years. And so you can see the modern kitchen that we were looking at or the kitchens that are here. They all have those things. But I don't know if you've had this happen. Something interesting happened to me. I was standing in someone's kitchen recently, and I had a napkin that I had used. I didn't want to be like, hey, can you throw this away? Throw it away. And even though I've been in a million kitchens in my life, not really a million, a lot, right? I had one question, and you may have had this question too if you've ever been standing in someone else's kitchen with a piece of trash. And I was like, where is the trash can? Where is it, right? Where do I put this? And so just by quick show of hands, if your trash can is in the pantry, can you raise your hand real quick? Can I see that? Nobody? Nobody? Wow, okay. If your trash can is just sitting out, you guys like, yeah, okay, just sitting out. Oh, wow, look at us. We are salt of the earth people. Very good, right? Now, if you have built a special cabinet for your trash can, because, can I see your hand real quick? We see bougie. Look at you, Pete. Living bougie. That's it. Okay. Any under the sink? Oh yeah, there you go. Under the sink. Anywhere else? Anywhere else? Did I forget? Like you're just like, I'm a grown man. And listen, I know I need to throw away the trash. I know that I'm not going to give it to somebody else. But I'm standing somewhere and I go, I'm not sure that I know how to do that here. And here's what you do: you look at somebody and you go, hey, where do you keep your trash can? You don't say, hey, do you have a trash can? I mean, you do if you're kind of rude. You're like, hey, you got a trash can? You're like, yeah, we got one. Where do you keep it? Likewise, there's a whole host of things that this happens. If you've ever had someone else put away your dishes out of the dishwasher, you're like, why is this here? And the reason it's there is because that's where it is in their house, right? Or if you're helping somebody else, you're like, hey, where do you keep the spoons? You're like, over here. Why are they over here? You know, you judge them inside, right? Not out loud, but you judge them inside on where they keep their stuff. Likewise, you could show up at somebody else's kitchen, and you could have instructions to bake a cake or cupcakes. You could have all the ingredients. You could have done it 1,000 times, but you will face the same question if you're in a brand new kitchen or someone else's. You're going to go, how do I do that here? How do I do that here? Now, as simple and as stupid as this illustration is, right? Like as stupid as, here's what I think can happen just as a person when it comes to following Jesus. I think we can read the Bible, and I think we can hear other people talk about it, and we could learn all that there is to know about the what and the how and the ingredients. But I don't know, just as a person, I think sometimes it's easy to read the Bible, hear someone else's story, and go, that's good for you. But what about my marriage? Like, I'm glad that works in your house and in your world of following Jesus. But what about my job? Peter, I'm glad that you followed Jesus as a fisherman. Man, I'm glad that you left your nets and you followed him. But what about my life in the whatever century we're in? How do I do that now? How do I do that here? How do I do that in this place? And look, I understand that other people, they've gone through this thing and yada, yada. But what about my illness? How do I follow Jesus here? What about my dating? What about we could just go on. What about my finances? Good for you. And in fact, if you've ever attended church at any point in your life, and you've heard some people talk about good things and you're in the middle of a difficult thing, you're going, great, bravo. What about me? How do I do that? And what Peter does so well in this book is he looks at a group of people just like you and just like me, and he goes, here, I need you to understand how to follow Jesus where you are right now. Because as a pastor, here's what I can tell you. As a pastor, not just as a person, but as a pastor, most of the confusion is about that question. Most of the questions are about that issue. Most of the tension that we feel, and I'm willing to bet that most of the decisions that you have to face and that we face in following Jesus are about that. How do I follow Jesus right here, right now? So here's what I'm hoping. Here's what I'm hoping and praying, quite honestly, for us as a church as we walk through this book. I'm hoping that if you're not a follower of Jesus, because look, not everybody in this room is a follower of Jesus. You don't have to be a follower of Jesus to come here. And so if you're just exploring Jesus, or if you're not a follower of Jesus, my hope for you is that as we go through this, you might actually get to try on following Jesus, or at least hear what it might be like. Do you know what I mean? Window shop a little bit. I'm not saying you have to follow Jesus, but you might go, okay, if I were to follow Jesus, I think Peter's going to say, here's what it might look like. Also, there's probably questions in your life where you've met people who claim to follow Jesus, and you're going, is that what it means to follow Jesus? And hopefully get some information that way. Okay, if you're a new follower of Jesus, if you just started that, or maybe you're coming back to that in your life, here's what I would hope that you would learn as we go through this as a church together. I would hope that if you're a new follower of Jesus, that you would actually find what Peter says in this book very, very helpful. In fact, I think you will. I think Peter's going to help detangle some stuff from culture and what we do with religion and what it actually means to have a relationship with Jesus in the world in which we live. And I hope that God might use this in your life to grow you a little bit. And then if you've been following Jesus, like if your walk with Jesus is longer than I've been alive, or people in here, right? Or if you call yourself a veteran Jesus follower, if you're in that camp, okay, you got the trash can in the little tiny like closet. If that's you, right? Like you've been following. Here's what I think Peter's going to do for us, for you, in that camp. I think Peter's going to actually say, hey, here's a caution. Because I think what happens when we follow Jesus for a long time is this, that we follow Jesus, and at some point, something happens that's unexpected. And as a longtime follower of Jesus, here's what you can think. You can think, this has never happened to anyone else who's followed Jesus before. You can think, why is this happening to me? Why is this right now? And what Peter's going to actually do and what he's going to unpack is this. He's going to show you, he's going to, hey, caution when you think that. Because in reality, it's kind of been this way for a long time. And so here's what we're going to do with the rest of our time this morning. We're going to jump into an introduction. We're just cover the first few verses of what Peter has to say, because I think it's very important. But before I do that, I just want to quickly go back to Peter for a second and show you why I think Peter, out of all the followers of Jesus who wrote letters, probably is the best person to answer this question, how do I follow Jesus here? One of the reasons I think he's the best person to do this is not because he's perfect to do this, but it's actually because he's not perfect. In fact, Peter was a pretty down-to-earth, blue-collar guy, right? In fact, Peter would be, if you read the Bible, he sometimes puts his foot in his mouth. Sometimes he's just trying to figure it out as he goes along. Peter is what the people who study this time period in history, they would call him this. He was from Galilee, and they would say Peter is the stereotypical Galilean. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I did some digging this week. Let me just give you some Galilean stereotypes. I didn't make these up, okay? So don't hate me. These are history people who write. This is a stereotypical. If you had said, I'm from Galilee, here's what they would have thought about you, and here's what may or may not have been true for you. So Galileans would be generous and impulsive. Okay, so they were very generous people. And they the type of guy who would give you like, your shirt off your back and at the same time might not use best judgment, right? You're like, man, I love them. They'll give you anything that they have. They'll share anything that they have with you. But man, they're a little impulsive. You don't know what's coming next. Okay, next thing, they're very simple-mannered. Very simple people. They lived along the shore. Many of them were fishermen. Many of them were tradesmen. Life was very simple. You know, they raised their family. They did what they did. And they would work hard, and they'd come home, and it was just very simple. But they had manners, right? So, you know, all that. Another thing, they were intensely nationalistic. So they lived near the sea, but they were also Jewish people inhabited by Rome, but at the same time, they had a strong sense of who they were, and they had a nationalist bent to them. Another one would be this. They were excitable, passionate, and sometimes violent, right? So you're like, they're from Galilee. They're very into what they're saying, and maybe we don't mess with them because they might get a little too far, if you know what I mean, right? Like, it sounds like these are the type of guys, ladies who, you know, that you knew if they're coming to a party, it was going to be a party in some form or fashion, right? Here's another one. I think it's the last one I have. They were notorious for neglecting the study of their language. So you know that they're a Galilean because they'd say, like, I don't talk good. And actually this is true, you can go through the Bible. There are times where people recognize where Peter's from because he had an accent, right? Now, just take a look at this list real quick, okay? I didn't write this list. I didn't make this. This is in a history book somewhere, all right? Then you go down this list. Do you start to think about a couple people you might know? You think about a type of people that we might know? I don't know about you, but I think about this person right here, right? I think about a good old-fashioned redneck. I'm like, Galileans, Peter was a good old boy. Like, he had an accent. He was just a down-to-earth dude. He'd give you the shirt off his back. At one point in time, someone's coming to get Jesus. He whips out a sword, cuts off his ear. And you're like, Peter. In fact, Jesus says that. He's like, Peter, what are you doing? You know, he's like, I don't know. You know, and Jesus heals his ear. That's crazy. One time, Peter's like, they see Jesus walking on the water, and all the other disciples are afraid, and Peter's like, if that's really you, tell me to come out there. And Jesus is like, come on out here. And he's like, all right. You know, and he goes. That's what he does. It's Peter. He's constantly doing that. And here's the thing. Jesus actually got to know Peter so well that he named him Peter. In fact, Peter grew up with the name Simon. That was his Simon. Sometimes he's called Simon Peter. Sometimes he's called Cephas, which is just the Aramaic version of Peter. And here's what Jesus said. Jesus looked at Peter, and he said, Peter, here's what you are. You're like a rock, right? You're pretty solid, but sometimes you're not too bright, right? Like, you're not going anywhere. You're pretty foundational. You're there, but at the same time, man, you're a rock. And what I think about that is I think about this depending on your age. You probably have this. If that sounds weird to you, we name people Rock or Rocky, right, all the time. In fact, I brought Rocky and The Rock, right? So these guys are just imposters. Peter was the OG, Rocky Balboa, and The Rock. That's who he is, okay? But here's what you're going to learn about Peter, is that when it comes to how do I follow Jesus here, here's why Peter's the perfect one. It's because of this. Peter got a lot of things right. He got a lot of things wrong. And this is actually a question that Peter had to figure out for himself. And so Peter writes to you and to me, and he writes to this group of people in a letter, and he's like, you got to know my life. Because I didn't get it right, and there are some things that I did, but I want to tell you how to follow Jesus here, because I've lived it, and I've learned it. Okay, so we're going to just jump into the first two verses today, is what we're doing. We're not going to go this slow through the entire book, okay? That's not how, but we will take our time. But 2 verses for today for the introduction. I think what Peter actually has to say is important to answering that question. We have something to learn this morning. And so here it is. This is 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. And here's what it says. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiled, scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus Christ and sprinkled with his blood. There's a lot there, right? If you're like, I'm not a geography person, you might have some questions. If you're going, I'm not a theology person, you probably have some questions, right? If you're just like, I'm just a person, you probably got some questions. And so here's what I actually want to do. I think Peter, in this text, specifically verses 1, and we'll get into verse 2 in a little bit too, but I think what Peter's doing is so important here that I would devote the rest of our time to it. I think what Peter's going to do in verse 1 is he actually sets up a mindset and a theme that carries itself out through the whole letter. In fact, here's what I would say. If you miss this conversation today, if you just kind of zone out from here on out for the last 20 minutes of what we're talking about, I think you're going to have a hard time understanding what it means to follow Jesus here and what Peter's actually saying. In fact, I think Peter sets up in this first section a mindset or a theme or an outlook that is pretty much foundational. And here's what I think I would say, that you feel this question and you feel this mindset even if you've never thought of it before. That when you're asking the question, how do I follow Jesus here in my job, in my life, in my marriage, that actually what you're asking is what Peter's attempting to answer right now for us in this section. And it's actually found right here. And this explains some of the tension, some of the frustration, and it comes down to a recognition of this word. It's this word here, exile. Exiles. So Peter looks at this group of people and he goes, I'm writing to you, exiles. In fact, you could go so far as to say this, Peter, how do I follow Jesus here? Here's what Peter wants us to know right off the bat. Here's what he looks at them and says to them. He says this, you are exiles. That's what you are. And if you don't wrap your mind around this, I think everything else is lost. You say, what do you mean? Right here, next slide. You are exiles. You're exiled. How do I follow Jesus here? First step, you're in exile. You're like, well, I don't know if that helps me very much. Thank you, Peter. I mean, I don't know what school you went to. I know you spent time with Jesus, but I don't know. What does that mean here? And so what we're doing for the rest of our time is just unwrapping this. What do you mean, Peter? And I think he actually gives us clues in this verse. I think he actually tells us here. In fact, when we talk about an exile, what an exile is, what we have to understand and have to recognize is this. Peter's calling our attention to two things. Same thing that he's calling their attention to, and that's this. He wants them to recognize where they are, and he wants to recognize who they are. And he's saying that if you recognize where you are, and if you just recognize who you are, here's the conclusion that you would come to, the people he's writing to. That conclusion is that you're in exile. And you're going, well, I'm not sure that that's super clear to us. Well, my hope is that it would be a little bit more. So he looks at, we're going to take a look at this, who they are and where they are, or where they are and who they are, to be more precise. And so he's writing to them, and he says, here's where they are. Where's clues? In verse 1, we know where they are. It says this, to God's elect exiles, they're scattered throughout the province of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Okay? Does anyone know where that is? Modern day what? Anyone know? Turkey, that's right. Modern day Turkey, right? But they're actually, beyond that, it is the empire. They're living in the empire. And so where are they? They're actually in the empire right here. Not that empire, if you know what that slogan is, right? That would be the Star Wars Empire, right? They're actually in the Roman Empire. And in the Roman Empire at that time, in modern-day Turkey, there were provinces. And so these provinces and these areas would have been under Roman rule. And so they're not cities, they're actually areas, regions. You can kind of see that with the color. This area, just for scale, if you're a history nerd or geography nerd, this area right here is about the size of California if you took California and tilted it on its side. I know some of us want to do that anyway, but if you do that, there you go. It's the size of Turkey right there. And he's writing to them. And here's what you need to know about Turkey and the Roman Empire at that point in time. He's writing to people who Paul had never visited, okay? So Paul had never gone to any of these places. So if you knew who Paul is, he was a missionary there. He didn't go over here. They haven't had an interaction with Paul. Many of the people he's writing to, in fact, most of the people he's writing to are Gentiles. In other words, they don't have a Jewish heritage. They didn't grow up with the Old Testament. They don't have an understanding of the Bible. And so if you didn't grow up in church, you're like, that's my people right there, right? They didn't get that. At this time in Rome, here's what was going on. There's a peace that was going on. They're enjoying peace. Peace because Rome had soldiers everywhere. So let's live peacefully, right? Because we know what happens if we don't. Rome was also very growing in the areas of art and literature. There would have been a lot of philosophy at the time, a lot of different varying philosophies coming out of this area. And the people there would have been polytheistic, and that's a fancy word for meaning that there were very different gods and very different religions, and everyone just kind of had their own thing that they were doing. And some people, historians tell us at this point, would actually look at the government or the ruler of that day, the Caesar, and they would say, oh, he's actually a god. And they actually begin to worship that government ruler like a deity and deify the government, right? And then so you have deification of the government, you have polytheistic, you got arts and culture and literature and all of that stuff. Very, very, very diverse. In fact, writing about this, Karen Jobes in her commentary, she puts it this way: the outstanding feature of the geographical destination of 1 Peter is the enormous diversity of the land, people, and culture. Okay, so automatically, right from the get-go, you know there's some things happening here which are a little bit different. In fact, here's what we would say about the Roman area. I think this is the next slide here, or not. But the Roman kind of thought of this day, would be this, that they were, you could say this about the people. If you were a follower of Jesus in this area, you would be the minority. You would also, secondly, be largely misunderstood. The culture at this time was largely misunderstood and hostile to the teachings of Jesus. And then lastly, this, that at this point in time, there was increasing social pressure to abandon the faith. So because of all this polytheism and thought and all that stuff, if you were a follower of Jesus, you'd feel like a minority, there'd be intense pressure, and there'd be large misunderstanding. No one would actually know what you're talking about. You'd be like, hey, you know, like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and people would go, no, who are they? And so maybe already you're beginning to see where this might begin to be relevant to some of our lives today. So that's where they are. He's saying, you guys are scattered throughout. You're living in the empire, in the Roman Empire. And then he writes to them, and notice he says something about who they are, right? And this is jumping ahead to Peter, apostle of Jesus Christ. Notice what he says, to God's elect. Now, if you didn't grow up in church, or if you didn't read the Bible, you're like, well, that's a weird word. Or maybe you went to a church where like the idea of election, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can check out for a second. But if the idea of election and theology, like that was a weapon or like a big issue in your faith. Here's what you need to know. Peter actually, when he uses the word elect, some of your Bibles say chosen, he's using a term that in that day and age would have only been used of one group of people specifically, and that would have been the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. And so all throughout the Bible, God is going to look at the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, and God's going to say, you're my elect, you're my chosen. And now the idea behind that is not about perfection. Like, you're the best, so I picked you, like we do on the playground for kickball. That's not how that works. In fact, God all through the Old Testament tells them, you guys are not great, but I chose you. And here's what he means. He's saying that not as perfection, but as possession. Look at what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6 in the Old Testament about the people of Israel. Here's what he said. You're my elect. He says, for you, Israel, are a people holy. That means set apart to the Lord, your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So it's about relationship. Election is not about perfection or about being good. Election is God going, you're mine. In fact, we have an idea and a phrase. In fact, I don't know if we still eat these candies or not. They're probably banned and maybe they're carcinogenic. I'm not sure. But when I was growing up, you had these little tiny, like powdery, I don't even know what they were, heart candies, and they'd have little messages on it called sweethearts. And on it, on the powdered ones, occasionally you get one that says, be mine, right? And if you gave that to somebody else and they said, be mine, you're not like, wow, you're really controlling. You wouldn't think that. You'd go, oh, you love me. It's this idea of you're mine. Like we are in a special connection, a special relationship. And God is looking at Israel and saying this. Now, why does this matter? Well, we got to remember who he's writing to. He's writing to Gentile people, people who were not chosen, people who did not have a special relationship with the Lord. People who would not have looked at them and said, oh yeah, we're God's chosen people. But he looks at people who grew up apart from God, apart from the Old Testament, apart from the Bible, and he looks at them and he goes, you know who you guys are? You're chosen. You're chosen. It's very fascinating. Look at what he says. He says, look, in verse 2, right here, Nope. Go back. Click it one more time. There we go. 1 Peter 1, 2, who have been chosen, look at that, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to be obedient to Jesus and sprinkled with his blood. Why did I highlight those in three? Because each one of those things not only is something that God is doing to them, not something they did, God is doing this to them, but each one of those things would have been terms to describe the Old Testament Israel nation. So we could go back, we're not going to spend all that time, but you can go back in the Bible and you could actually look and see where each one of these terms is used to refer to Israel and saying, like, this is who you are. And Peter is looking at you and me and people who didn't grow up in the Jewish faith, and he's like, you know who you are? You're adopted into this family. That the people outside of Israel have actually been brought in. You're part of a different group of people. In other words, you were born in a country far from God. You were born not in the Jewish, and you've been brought into a family that God is building. He's chosen you. He's brought you in. How? Through his Spirit and through responding to Jesus. That when you come to know Jesus, it's actually something that God is doing to you. He takes you out of your world and your life and brings you into his world and his life and his family. He adopts you into that family to have a relationship with him. In fact, this is something that Peter had to learn because there was a lot of hostility between Jewish people and Gentiles. There was a lot of anger, a lot of history of abuse there, back and forth. And Peter, actually in his own life, had to be taught this. And we see this in Acts chapter 10, 34. Peter actually went to a Gentile's house. He was invited to share the gospel with them. And to Peter's amazement, these Gentile believers responded to Jesus, and Peter saw life change in their life. And Peter comes back to the church, which was just mostly Jewish people back then, and he looks at them, and here's what he says. Then Peter began to speak, I now truly understand that God does not show favoritism, but God welcomes those from every nation who fears him and does what is right. And so Peter's looking at people in the middle of a scattered area of Roman territory who didn't grow up with the Bible and didn't grow up with the Old Testament. And he goes, because of Jesus, you know who you are? You've been brought into a new family. So if you can imagine growing up with customs and gods and religion that were very different than Jesus, and now Peter's looking at you and going, you now live in this place, but you've got a new family with new customs and new traditions and new history. He wants them to know who they are. In fact, all of us, if you've ever seen any of the Harry Potter movies, you get this, right? Who's Harry Potter? He's a guy who lives under a staircase, right? And doesn't know who his real parents are. But the whole story is about Harry learning who he really is. Turns out he's got some special magical powers, and his mom and dad weren't just normal people, and there's other people who are kind of, he's learning, what does it mean to find this out? And in some strange sort of weird backward way, as I can make an illustration, following Jesus is a little bit like Harry Potter. Because what happens is God does a work in your life, and then you go, well, then who am I again? And who are my parents? What does it mean to be part of this family, right? Do I get a wand? No. If you go to a church, they give you a wand, just leave, okay? That's how that works. It's not the best thing. But you can see, okay, so these people, they're in a place where they grew up, but yet they're part of a different family, and they're trying to figure that out. And here's what you find, when we learn about who they are. They would have been wrestling with some of the same tension, because here's what people in the early church or in the early Roman Empire thought about Christians. Imagine this. You're growing up in a town, and now your friends start thinking this way. We know about this because of a book called The Octavius of the Minucius Felix. You can go order it on Amazon if you want to fall asleep at night. But in this book, we have firsthand account, and what's happening is this guy is writing to a friend of his who is a Roman citizen who's converted to Christianity. And what he's doing is he's writing, and he's actually accusing him of some of the things that Christians would have been known for or thought about at that point in time. Because it was very confusing. And here's what he actually accuses early Christians of. They would have looked at early Christians and said, you know what you are? You guys are atheists. Atheists. You say, that's weird. Because we say atheists today, we mean we don't believe in God. But they would have called Christians atheists because they didn't believe in the gods. They didn't believe in the Greek gods. So you're atheists. How dare you defy the gods? Gods were attached to work. They were attached to all kinds of every aspect of life. And so Christians kind of stepped back and said, you're atheists. Also, he accuses him of this, that Christians practiced incest. You're like, wait, what? That's weird. It is weird. They did not, okay? But here's what they've heard. They would hear these Christians, families, looking at one another and calling one another brother or sister. Because the Bible says once you're brought into this family, you're like a spiritual family. And then they'd hear that brother got married to sister, and that's really weird to somebody outside the Christian faith, right? And it should be weird, okay? Anyway, unless you're from Alabama, and that's a whole other day, right? Okay, sorry. Anyway, just gotta make sure you're awake, all right? We're still good? Okay. And next, let's keep moving. Cannibals. Cannibals. You say Christians are cannibals? Like, what do you mean? Well, they would go, and all they would know is they would have these secret meetings and these secret meals where they would come out talking about eating the body and drinking the blood. Right? And so because of our Western culture and actually the advancement of Christianity, you would know that probably what we're talking about is something called communion, or the symbolic blood and grape juice here, because we're like aware of our recovery community and stuff like that, right? Grape juice symbolizes blood of what Jesus did, and then the body is like literally bread. He said, "This is my body broken for you." And so Jesus said, every time you take part of those things, you're remembering and declaring him. So they would have looked and said Christians are cannibals. Additionally, they would have said Christians are also unintelligent. They're just dumb. The things they believe, they don't make sense to us. And they would have said this, they're pretty self-righteous. And so he accuses actually this guy, Octavius, of being all those things. Now, what I think is funny and interesting is that's AD 64. But if you were just to take a look at 1,960 years from here, here's what you would find out in 2024. It's pretty same, right? In fact, many of us, maybe some of us would even say this if you're not a follower. You're like, hey, Christians are intolerant. I've seen them be intolerant, and I've heard them be intolerant. Christians are hypocritical. Following Jesus, people who do that, they're bigoted. People, they're unintelligent. They're self-righteous. And can I just say, as a pastor, if you've never heard a pastor say this, man, we as a church, not maybe our church specifically, I hope not, but at capital C church in the world, can I just say, can we own some of this stuff? Like, we've not done a great job, 100%, of making this not true. But when you read the teachings of Jesus and when you look at what it really means to follow Jesus, some of this stuff actually, in fact, a lot of this stuff should fall away. Right? And so they're living in this tension and in this. And it's maybe if you're starting to feel this and understand this, you're actually getting back around to a full idea of what it actually means when Peter looks at them and says, you guys are in exile. Right? Remember, he writes, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect exiles. So an exile, right, is somebody who is living in a country in which they grew up, the Roman Empire, and yet also not really from there, but from there, right? In fact, the word exile, if you just read all the translations of the Bible, it doesn't translate 100% great to us in our text, but here's what other versions say. So when he says you're in exile, so the NSB version, that's a different version of the Bible, says alien. Another translation, I should say, rather than version, foreigners, you're foreigners. Another one says you're pilgrims. Someone says temporary resident, strangers. Now, what's interesting is the people to whom Peter is writing, they would have said, I grew up here. What do you mean I'm a foreigner? I know everybody in my town. What do you mean I'm a stranger? Man, I'm not really traveling. I have roots here. I got a company here, and we're a pilgrim and a foreigner, and we're an alien? And what Peter's saying is that's a little bit what it feels like, right? But more than just a feeling, Peter's actually referring to a fact. In fact, he's referring specifically to an event in Israel's history that would have been familiar to Jewish people, but a little bit foreign to these people to whom he's talking to. In fact, if you were to look up in Israel's history, there was a time when they went into exile. In fact, in Jeremiah 52:27, if you take a look back, there was a time in which the nation of Israel was taken away and attacked by the countries of Assyria and Babylon. And specifically Judah. The nation of Judah, Israel split north and south. They had a civil war. And anyway, there you go. And Babylon comes over. They kill a bunch of people. But Babylon, instead of just destroying everybody, they picked everyone up, the prisoners and the captives, and they took them back to live in Babylon and gave them different names and had them worship their gods. And this is actually what Jeremiah 52:27 says. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death so that Judah was led away into exile from this land. And here's what some commentators think, and I think they're right, that when Peter looks at people living in the Roman Empire, yet chosen by God, he goes, it's a little bit like that. In fact, we know this because at the end of the book, at 1 Peter 5, chapter 12, he says this, the church who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings. Now, Peter's writing from Rome, the capital city of the Roman Empire. And Peter says, you know where I'm writing from? Babylon. So people in Babylon are writing, and he's thinking this way. And he wants us to think this way too. See, when you think a lot about maybe if you are a follower of Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus right now in this world, I bet you're going, I'm just still learning on who I am. Still learning about my family history. And at the same time, even though you maybe grew up around here, or maybe you're just like, you've always been an American, maybe you haven't, I don't know, but you're going, and yet where I live is not really home. In fact, writing about this, one of the commentators puts it this way. He says that following Jesus and being in exile is the coming together of two incompatible truths. Where I live and who I am. And I think if you were just to take two minutes and just do some math maybe in your head of your life, you might come up with a little picture that looks like this. Right? That we are followers of Jesus. If you do know him, you're an elect, you're part of this family, and yet you're living in this world of some empire, right? And then our life really takes place in that little overlap. That little overlap is called exile. And that little overlap is a tension. That's where the tension is, isn't it? In fact, that's where some of the frustration comes from. Like, why are other people, it looks like, and I get on Instagram and I scroll and it's so easy for them. Why is it not easy for me? That area, I'm willing to bet that's where most of the questions come up in your life of what it means to follow Jesus here. What do I do here now? Because I live in this world, but I'm also not from this world, but I am from this world, and who am I really? I'm just learning that identity. I would say this, can I say this just as a pastor? That tension that lives there, that tension never goes away this side of eternity. Never does. And I would say that this question of what does it mean to follow Jesus, how do I follow Jesus here, it's right there in that little section, and that question is actually something that every generation of Jesus followers has to ask over and over and over and over again. Never goes away. And I'm willing to bet that if you're wrestling with some sort of temptation in your life, that temptation exists right there in that little tiny section. It can be a weird experience. It can. In fact, I was thinking about what this means to live as an exile and where we're headed in this study together. And I was thinking a little bit about this picture here. And some of you may be able to tell what this is from the screen, maybe if you've been to one before. You'll notice this is looks like a club, but everybody's got these little green headphones on. This is actually a silent disco. Right? If you've ever been to a silent disco or know what a silent disco is, some of you can Google that later. But you go in, you get a pair of headphones, and here's what's happening. There's no house music. You can't hear it. You select the music, and you dance to it. And if you were to walk into a silent disco with no headphones on, you just see a lot of people quietly, differently dancing. And you're like, isn't that just life nowadays, right? You know, you walk outside, isn't that just the internet? Like, isn't that like it'd be really confusing because, and then sometimes they're all listening to the same thing, and sometimes they're listening to different thing, and it can be very confusing, especially if someone's got a waltz on. I don't know why you're listening to waltz at a silent disco, but you got a waltz on, and this person over here is listening to hip hop, and this person over here is listening to classical music. They're all gonna be looking and dancing different, and you don't hear any of it, and it doesn't make any sense. And what's interesting is writing about this, even before he ever knew what a silent disco is, in fact, I think he died not knowing what a silent disco is, the philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, not a follower of Jesus, says this, to those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. What's Nietzsche saying? What's a silent disco saying? What's Peter saying? He's saying that the experience of living in exile feels a little bit like that. That from the outside, people are going to look in who don't hear the music of following Jesus and go, that's insane. And that's crazy. And there are times where you're going to look over and be like, it seems like everybody else is doing something else, and I feel like I'm alone in the middle of this. So real quick, what's the decision? As we land this plane, what's the decision? And here's what it is. I think there's not just a tension, not just a question. There's a decision that we have to make. Because I think when it comes to living in exile, each one of us, whether it's in our marriage, whether it's in our jobs, whether it's in our finances, whether it's in the way that we live out and love others, or the way that I date, or in every area we have a decision to make in that. In fact, one of the hallmarks of living in exile is that everything's a decision. Have you ever thought about that? Like, why do I have to decide everything? I just want something else decided for me. We do not live in a day and age in which following Jesus has everything decided for you. That was 1950. Okay. We live in a day and age which every aspect of following Jesus requires a decision, and it feels exhausting. Because you go, I just wish someone else could choose for me. But that's not the way it's been, and that's not the way it is. And so Peter's going to write, and he's going to write, and he's going to say there's some options that you have. Here's what we're going to see as we go ahead. He says you have some options. First option is this. You could literally sell out. You could just say, forget it. I'm going to do whatever the empire's doing. I'm going to drop the election part. I'm just going to jump right into the empire. It's a lot easier that way. Forget the tension. Tension's resolved. I do what everybody else does. You can do that. That's an option in exile. And I think we could tell stories, and maybe you yourself could talk about how there were times where you do that. And I don't think it's all or nothing, guys, right? I think it's easy to do that in an area of life, and in another area of life, still not. And so you could sell out. Peter's also going to say, hey, guys, not only can you sell out, but here's another option. You could lash out. You could take a look at that empire, and you could say that way is backwards or that way is wrong, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fight it. And I'm going to get online, I'm going to bring out my phone, and I'm going to tweet everyone to death. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to send it out there, and I'm going to yell at people, and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to take to the streets. I'm going to burn something down because it's different. We got to fight the Roman Empire. And I'll tell you, Peter's going to say, guys, that's not the option you should choose. He's going to say that. He's going to say, hey, you could sell out, you could lash out. And then I think the easiest, quite honest temptation in the middle of all this stuff, the easiest decision to make sometimes in the middle of exile is this, just to check out. Check out. Now, I'm just going to we're going to move out to the country, and nothing wrong with the country, but if you're doing that to escape the tension, you can't. You could try, you can do a really good job. You're like, watch me, right? You're like, watch me. You could do that. I'm sure there's places where you could do that. Or, better yet, you could set up an alternate Christian version of what you see in Babylon and just kind of live in that little incubated safe space. But here's the truth. Peter's going to look at Christians who are doing that, and he's going to say, guys, that's not the right option either. It's not just to huddle together until Jesus comes back and just wait it out. Right? He's going to look at you, and he's going to look at me, and he's going to look at the followers of Jesus in the middle of the Roman Empire, and here's the drastic, crazy thing that he's going to say to them. Here's the decision you have to make. He's like, here's what followers of Jesus do in exile. He's like, I'm going to dare you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to push you because he wants them to stand out. Here's what Peter's going to say. Peter's going to say, and here's what I think you'll find, that in every area that we explore in this letter, Peter's going to look at you and me, and he's going to say, if you live in that tension, and if you're willing to say that I am an exile, and if you operate out of that mode, that what's going to happen is the way in which you live is going to be different. It's going to be noticeable. And the decisions that you're going to make are going to seem backwards to some, and you might catch some heat for it. But more than anything else, that even as you do that, what happens is that when followers of Jesus of a different family live in a time and an empire of a different place, and they hold those two things in tensions, people see Jesus and God gets the glory. And Peter says that's what it means to follow Jesus here. In fact, God would say this to Israel in Babylon. Here's what God said to them way back when. He says, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles who have sent from Jerusalem into Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Man, that's hard. How do we do that? How do I follow Jesus? I'm glad you asked. Peter's glad you asked, because that's where we're going. All right, so how do we follow Jesus here? I think the first step before anything else is you have to be willing to hold those two things in tension and say, I'm in exile. That's me. And so as the band comes up, I just want to share one last thing with you in this moment, and that's this, that when it comes to actually saying, I'm in exile, what does that mean? It's interesting, the United States Army and military has formed a slogan that is not very popular to say in church. In fact, I debated whether I'm going to say it or not, but it's in the culture and you can Google it, and it's not a curse word. At least in my household it was growing up, but it's not now. Nate Bargatze talks about it in his latest comedy stand-up. But there's a phrase in the United States Army and military that says, Does anyone know this? Can I make you say it instead? Embrace the suck. That's what they say. And what they're saying is that there's the reality of the life in which they live is difficult at times. And it's not going to change, and it's not going to move, and there's this tension between what you think is a reality the way it ought to be and the exact reality of what you find yourself right now. And so what you do and the way that you get through that is you just embrace the suck. You say, this is what it is. And what's fascinating is if you actually look in the United States military and you go back a little bit further in it, this idea of this tension has been around forever. There's this guy named Karl von Karlswitz, weird name, 1600s, you forget it, but he wrote this way before we ever learned the slogan. He says this, it is this friction, or what is so termed here, which makes that which appears easy in war difficult in reality. And people today, army historians will take a look at this guy in the 16th century and go, you know what he's doing right there? You know what he's talking about? He's talking about embrace it. Embrace the suck. That's what he's saying. That's what this old guy is saying. It's always been there, and it's always been around. And so there's a sense in which I think when we look in this passage, and when you hear me talk about, hey, you're in exile, you might hear it this way in this slide right here, that when he's saying, how do I follow Jesus here? Embrace the exile. Embrace the exile. Now, there's a part of it that's true, because Peter wants you to know it's exile. But I think there's a part of it which, if all you do today is you hear me say, just grit your teeth and do it, you'll never be able to do it. I think there's a part in which you just look at this and go, man, I just got to embrace it. Here we go. You look at your spouse and you go, embrace the exile. Like, okay, maybe, I don't know, maybe you're in a fight and you just look at her and go, or him, and you're like, embrace the exile. I got a crazy moment in your house. Or you're dating and you're like, you don't want to go? No, just embrace the exile. Right? I don't know, right? Maybe it's a slogan. Maybe make a shirt. Maybe hashtag embrace the exile. I'm not sure. But here's what I want you to understand. It is not a simply grit your teeth and bear it thing. And that if that's all you ever do is just grit your teeth and bear it, that you're missing something else. I think here's what Peter would say to you and me. I think Peter would say it's not just about doubling down and making it harder. I think Peter would take a look at you and me and he goes, unless you understand who the ultimate exile is, you'll never actually be able to embrace the exile in your life. I think Peter would say, I knew the ultimate exile. I watched him. I met him. He changed my life. I think Peter would say that Jesus Christ is the first and the OG exile. In fact, Jesus said that of himself. He said this in John chapter 17, verse 15 and 17. He says, the world has hated them because they are not of the world. He's talking about followers of Jesus. They are not of the world. And he says, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. And Jesus is praying for you and for me, and he's going, don't take them out. Don't just come and get them, but protect them. And he says this, they are not of the world. Again, just as I am not of the world. And here's what Jesus says, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And so how did God send Jesus into the world? He loved the world. So he sent Jesus into the world, so that he might live in the world, but not of the world, so that through him the world might be saved. And until you've understood that personally in your own life, there's no point in being in exile. Because it's the ultimate exile. The guy who left his throne in heaven above, came down here, died for you and me, so he might look at you and me and go, I love the world, I'm sending you into the world. I know it will hate you, but I love it. And if you hold those things in tension, they will see me. Not because you're perfect, not because you've all figured it out, but because of what I've done on the cross and in my resurrection to save people who don't know me yet. Now, how do we embrace the exile? You got to embrace Jesus. You got to understand who he is, to understand who you are, and understand where you live. So I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to wrap this up, and then next week we're going to keep going. But my hope and my prayer for us as a church is that we would know for the very first time, maybe for some of us, how it means to follow Jesus here in my marriage, in my life, in my job. Because we, for the very first time, understand that that tension's not going away, and that we're in exile until he comes back. So I'm going to pray for you, Father. I just pray this morning for us as a church that we would feel the friction of living in a world that is maybe where we grew up and were raised, but also one in which we're not fully home. Lord, that we would learn who we are, that you have actually changed our lives. God, I pray for the person who's here, and we just go down the list. They're selling out. Maybe there's areas which we've talked about today, and it's like, man, I realized I've totally forgotten who I am. Maybe for those of us who are lashing out at our neighbors or our coworkers or our friends or our family members because we think this world is something to conquer or fight. For those of us who've just checked out, we've washed our hands of the whole thing. It's a lot easier just to live in our bunker in our home and shut the door in the garage door and not engage. Lord, I pray that as we walk through this study that we'd stand out as a church. That you would use us to bring you glory and honor in the good things, in the difficult things, and in the hard things in intention. Lord, we love you. Thank you for being the ultimate one to come, leave your home, and live in a world that was not your home, so that you might make us part of your family. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.